Louisa. Louisa. Louisa.
Peace, peace. How y'all doing? Let me know if you could hear me straight up. What's good? Your rock? How you been? We got my man Sadiq in the building. We got Haley Merriam in the building. I'm happy to have y'all here. This is gonna be a quick impromptu live. And I'm gonna go ahead and share the link for y'all who want to join me. We about to freestyle on an article that I've been meaning to respond to for quite some time. Just about Diop and the legacy of Diop's scholarship. So I want to make this an open floor type of conversation that we could all communicate and collab on. As I go through and read this article. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read the article and then I'm gonna, have my own take on it. I'm gonna go back and forth and give y'all what I think, and then we're gonna go through my sources and just deal with the topic at hand. So first off, I just want to detail like why we're having this conversation. So a lot of people, they're under the impression that Cheikh Anta Diop was a Hamiticist, and they're under the impression like they mischaracterize Africana scholarship and Africana research as being Hamiticist, and that's completely false. It's completely inaccurate. Now, the problem with that is it ignores some of the primary themes of Africana scholarship, the purposes of Africana scholarship, and a lot of the different questions that people may have. So, I've been, going back and forth with folks on Twitter, just dealing with some of the different elements of my research and just dealing with some of the different paradigms that we've been shifting with respect to, the history of Africa and the development and evolution of African cultures. And one of the primary themes that, I've heard, this is a comment written on my X account, my Twitter account. It says, don't see any value in linking sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a really key. We speak about all the time about how sub-Saharan Africa is a racist term. But this comment says, don't see any value in linking sub-Saharan Africa to that of Egypt. Another thing, those of y'all who have seen my content, that we avoid that term. We don't really use the term Egypt. We more so use the term Kimi or Kemet, for the land of or the nation of Black people. So it says, don't see any value in linking sub-Saharan Africa to that of Egypt, especially that we, the Blacks, are in serious socioeconomic and political degeneration. Is it seeking validation? So this is, and I want to see actually if I could put this up on the screen, it would be better. Let me put this up on the screen so y'all can really read. Y'all can really read what I'm referring to, because to me this comment kind of speaks to the ignorance. It speaks to the ignorance that exists among Black people with respect to the evolution of African cultures, whether or not there's an isolationist evolution or a deeply interconnected. Yeah, what's good? No BS. I just wanted to do this impromptu live, just to have some fun and everything and make it do what it do. So right now I'm gonna share a screen right here. And if y'all can see this, give me a 1 in the comments if y'all can see this and if you can hear me loud and clear. I don't know if y'all can see that on the screen. Yeah, you don't see the let me remove the brand, because you see the okay, now you see this. Okay, so this is a reference to a lecture that Dr. John Henry Clark gave about the development of civilizations in the Geneva or the Niger River Valley, right? And according to the research of Dr. John Henry Clark, the invasions and the conquest of ancient Kimi, right, this led to a dispersal of pharaonic populations westward in Inner Africa. And that resulted in the subsequent establishment of states like Ouagadougou, which many popularly know as Ghana, Niani, which many popularly know as Mali, and Songhai on the Geneva River Basin or the Niger River Basin. And one of the comments by Mabelu Matai, it says, again, don't see any value in linking sub-Saharan African history to that of Egypt, especially that we, the blacks are in serious socioeconomic and political degeneration? Is it seeking validation? Now, there's many different ways. This person's obviously ignorant and is obviously has never studied under a legitimate Africana professor. But again, sub-Saharan African, false. We use infra-Saharan African after Shamarka Keita, or inner African. Egypt, false. Kemet, the nation of black people, city of black people, place of black people. So if by right off the bat, if he understood the true meaning of Kemet, right, he would not put a distinction, or he would not put a contrary between black and Kemet, or black and Kim. He would say, when you're speaking about Kemet, you're speaking about black people, wherever they may be. So again, the socioeconomic political degeneration aspect, if you understood these Africana scholars like John Henry Clark, Theophilo Benga, you would understand the necessity, the quintessential essence of using classical African civilizations as a blueprint and as a prototype. Engineers, I'm an engineer, we always deal with prototypes. They would be a prototype for the development of Africa today in the modern world. So the answer to socioeconomic and political degeneration is to have the proper orientation and understand our history, right? In classical Africa to modern Africa when it comes to the development of these paradigms. So like that's one of the major aspects that I wanted to get into, and just deal with, just some of the pertinence of Dr. John Henry Clark's research today, and just the pertinence of some of the lectures that he gave with respect to the development of Ouagadougou, and how, the development of Ouagadougou with respect to the Tichit culture really confirms a lot of the research of Cheikh Anta Diop and a lot of the research of these Africana scholars. I'm not going to get into the deep details of that today. I actually have a video that I'm going to release soon that gets into why the research of the archaeology of the ancient Tichit culture proves, the Ethiopian migration model correct. But this is kind of what I wanted to enter into, right? And if for those of y'all who follow me on X, I could be hella cutthroat. I got a lot of fecal brain assimilationists who are, at me in my feed right now because they want to make Juneteenth an assimilationist holiday. But, Juneteenth, Freedom Week, Emancipation Week, really Emancipation Month is kind of speaks to why we're here today and why we're promoting Pan-African nationalism, why we're promoting Black solidarity, why we're promoting, the accurate portrayal of African memory, why we are defending our Africana scholars from these, nonsensical attacks, this BS propaganda, white Arab propaganda, anti-Black racism. While we have to do all of these things because it's important that, our future generations, they start on the right footing. Shout out to Pan-African James in the building. Shout out to Ancient History with Obi in the building. Shout out to my dude Jason Holmes. The people of Ghana have stories about how the kingdom was started by Kemetic priests leaving Kemet during invasion. And that's facts. When you're dealing with the Urere traditions and Giabe Sise and the ancestors of Dinga Sise, they distinguish themselves from the founders of the Tichit culture, or the ancient ones, who they call Kakoro. And they also say that the immediate predecessors of them in the area of Ouagadougou was the Galoma people. And according to the research of Dr. John Henry Clark, he connected these Galoma people, defined by the Soninke oral narratives, to Burkina Faso, or the Volta River Valley. And he actually used the term Masi or Musi to define them. And we're going to get into that, when I release the video. I'm going to get into some of the facts surrounding that. And we're going to have a full spectrum perspective. So right now I'm going to share this article that we're talking about. Pretty popular article, I could say. And it's by a blogger by the name of Isaac Samuel. I think y'all could see this on the screen. If you cannot, yeah, y'all can. So I'm gonna go to the very, very top, and before I start, I'm gonna get a quick drink of water, and then we finna go in. All right, I'm gonna make sure, you know, I want to make sure this is enjoyable. So rest in peace, rest in power to the elder. You know, Dr. Clark is definitely a legend. He's a respected elder over here. So slander against him will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at all. I'm trying to get to my background. All right, so let me play this. Music at a good level. All righty, so we're gonna get into this article. Y'all hear that? Oh wait, hold up. All right, you want to make it bigger? Y'all see that good? Let me know. Like, give me a one if you can see it. If you can see it good. All right, for sure. So this is by a blogger by the name of Isaac Samuel. The article is entitled Eurocentrism, Afrocentrism, and the Need to Decolonize African History. Right. So I think we could all agree about the need to decolonize African history. And the subtitle is Moving Beyond Racist Theories and Fictitious Past. Right. So he gets into it. He says the foundation of Eurocentrism and the Hamitic theory. So the Hamitic theory is something that we discuss on this page a lot. You know, just the falsification of African history. I actually had a show with, you know, Brother Shaka Ra, and, you know, we were talking about just some of the flaws of Hamiticism and why it's incorrect to make, to classify Cheikh Anta Diop as a Hamiticist. So he says Western historiography of Africa is considered to have begun in large part after Napoleon's discovery of ancient Egypt in 1798. Now, to pause here, I don't think that's completely accurate. There were Romans who discussed African people. There were Greeks who discussed African people. You know, Herodotus, you know, he spoke about the Garamantes and the Ethiopians. Even in some of the earlier biblical narratives, you know, these Abrahamic narratives, there were people who were discussing African history as well during that time. So I don't think this first sentence is completely accurate. But if you're talking about the modern, you know, variant of historiography, you know, especially when you're dealing with the linguistic paradigm and the archaeological paradigm, maybe it's a little bit better with that context. So then it says, prior to that, European scholars had little knowledge of ancient civilizations on the African continent as a whole, both North and Sub-Saharan Africa, except for some flirtations with it in the writings of early explorers and Arab writers. And having to acknowledge the impressive historical achievement of Egypt, Europeans were forced to reconcile this new discovery with their presumption of their own racial superiority by reclassifying the ancient Egyptians, who they had previously regarded as black, as racially white. So, you know, things we discussed before, you know, there's not too much wrong with that, but we can continue. It was then that European scholars came up with several theories on how to bring African history into the racial geographic understanding of world history, which was at the time heavily influenced by scientific racism, notably by the Göttingen School of History that subdivided the world into three major races: Caucasoids, Mongoloids, and Negroids. These classifications had no basis scientifically, but they were nevertheless relevant to rationalizing European expansionism, slavery, and the racial caste system in the Americas, and seemed to complement the prevailing interpretation of the Curse of Ham and Abrahamic religions, which initially associates Hamites with barbarism and slavery rather than civilization. That is not necessarily completely true. Well, first of all, you know, I want to get into the Caucasoids, Mongoloids, and Negroids. This is from cladistics or taxometrics, the statistical coordination of human traits. And it actually lives on with people who want to promote what Dr. Shamarka Keita called the genetic version of the Berlin Conference, where they want to separate Congoids, Niloids, Bontoids, Afro-Asioids, and they want to use all these oids. I call them the oid squad. They want to use all these oids to separate African people on the continent. So they're continuing a lot of this racist classification into the modern world. And when he talks about European expansionism and the racial caste system in the Americas, I think it's important to speak to the global nature of this theory, because the enslavement of Africans was an international thing. So I think that's a key that we want to key in on. And then when he's talking about the curse of Ham, the Hamites of the Bible, Nimrod was the founder of civilization in the Bible, and Nimrod is originally associated with being the founder of civilizations. So it's not necessarily true that the understanding of Ham was always connected to barbarism. Within the biblical consciousness, or within the biblical narrative, you have plenty of people who are associated with, civilization and greatness, such as Nimrod. And then you have others like the Hittites and Uriah. You have the Philistines, which would all be descendants of a Hamite lineage. The issue was about morality and piety. That's generally what, the understanding of the Hamites were. You could look in the book of Isaiah when it discusses, certain elements of Cush and certain elements of Mitzrayim, who the prophet Isaiah within the Bible thought were very arrogant and thought were, they were ignorant and egotistical, and they believed that they could survive on their own without any, help from Yahweh or God. So I don't think this interpretation is fully encapsulating in an accurate way what biblical scholars saw Ham as. I would say that it's probably much later. It's definitely much later with Rabbi Rashi, 10th, 11th century rabbi, Solomon ben Isaac. He was a rabbi in France, and he is one of the main ones who originated the curse of Ham as a way to denigrate African people and insult African people. But prior to, Rabbi Rashi, the infamous rabbi, it wasn't a common association to make Black people as uncivilized or Black people as barbaric. So that's one of the pieces here that's a little bit inaccurate. But we could continue on. So these categories not only entered mainstream discourse in various academic disciplines, they also became the very foundations of such, particularly anthropology and history, and were popularized in the philosophies of Friedrich Hegel and the writings of Francis Galton. To a degree, I could say that that's true. Even though, some of the defenders of Darwin, they would probably want to limit his association with Galton, because Darwinism, Darwin was a racist. Darwinism does have racist elements. And I know it's a lot of atheists, Black atheists and Black evolutionary enthusiasts who like to defend Darwin. But Darwin definitely was racist, and his research was definitely connected to the period of eugenics and social classical evolution. Friedrich Hegel, he was obviously racist. So, that's definitely something that we need to consider. So when we look at, we got a chat here, a comment here by Nyoka. Blameless Ethiopian must have had serious problems for the Eurocentric. Yeah, they definitely caused serious problems for the Eurocentrics. So it was within this context that the Hamitic hypothesis arose. This elaborate racialist anthropological theory was refined in the early 20th century by British ethnologist Charles Seligman. It posits that Hamites were European, racially white pastoralists who were able to conquer indigenous agriculturalists because they were not only better armed with iron weapons, which they are suggested to have introduced into sub-Saharan Africa, but also supposedly quicker-witted. Now, the time span of this is a little bit off. Now, he mentioned Napoleon before, but I think, some of the earlier linguists and anthropologists like Friedrich Müller and Westermann and Meinhof, they would need to be mentioned. Champollion would need to be mentioned, because even before, Seligman, Champollion was one of the main ones who had the invective to just denigrate African people in the association with Hamites, these white Caucasian pastoralists. So timing is a little bit off, but generally speaking, it's not as bad. Despite a few mistakes here and there, it's not as bad. The Hamitic theory reversed the earlier view about Ham, the son of Noah, and his progeny from the archetypical barbarian to the harbinger of civilization in Africa. And again, Ham was not seen as barbaric. The barbarism came post Rashid, and during the time when a lot of these Christians wanted to justify the enslavement of African people. It incorporated the idea of white racial superiority and completely erased and denied the existence of Black African states, inventions, and cultural achievements, instead attributing them to the influence of outsiders. This was the foundation of the Eurocentric interpretation of African history, where African cultural accomplishments were ultimately tied with or derived from Western civilization, a vague categorization that includes all Mediterranean civilizations that Europeans appropriated as their own, such as Sumerians, Phoenicians, and Egyptians. The foundations of Eurocentrism were laid by, among others, George Hegel, from whom the modern arbitrary divisions of Northern Sub-Saharan Africa are attributed. And again, this is very important because Hegel was the creator of the so-called Sub-Saharan African. And prior to Hegel, you didn't really have a conceptualization of that. And it's really a pseudoscientific conceptualization because, if you're talking about the 23 or the 23rd degree north parallel, the southern part of Kemi or ancient Kemet definitely falls in line with that. So, Kemet in its southernmost extent would be classified as a tropical civilization. But these scholars would want to put it in North Africa just because of their racial dynamic. So Hegel claimed Africa consists of 3 continents which are entirely separate from one another and between which there is no contact whatsoever. He classifies Africa into European Africa, which is Northern Africa, from the Atlantic coast, including Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. He claims this region has always been subject to foreign influences, that this is a country which merely shares the fortunes of great events enacted elsewhere, but which has no determinate character of its own. Next in this classification is Egypt, which he gives a triple classification as in Asia, Europe, and it's on its own. He writes that Egypt became the center of great independent culture, and lastly, Africa proper, identified as Sub-Saharan Africa, which he claims has no historical interest of its own and remained cut off from the rest of the world. It was on this foundation of deliberate erasure and dismissal that the themes in the modern of African history were constructed: scientific racism and social Darwinism. Eurocentrism was not just a perverse underbelly in the interpretation and understanding of African history. It has the basis of its creation. European anthropologists, philosophers, historians, and explorers formed these preconceived theories about what Africa was, how it came to be, and who its people were even before stepping foot on the continent itself, but were nevertheless regarded as authoritative figures from whom the authoritative and accurate interpretation of African history was to be sourced. So here's an outline of Eurocentric founders and founders of the modern studies of African history. So it was within this racial context that the so-called founders of the different branches of African historiography established their fields of study, often based on blatant racist ideologies that were at times criticized even by their contemporaries. In the late 19th century in southern Nigeria, Leo Frobenius, one of the earliest and influential historians of Yoruba society, claimed to have found evidence of the mystical city of Atlantis in Ile-Ife, the cultural birthplace of the Yoruba, claiming that the Yoruba preserved the last remnants of a seafaring Etruscan civilization, that one of the European deities, Olokun, was the Greek god Poseidon, and that the gloom of Negrodom had overshadowed him. Hence, the Yoruba descend from glory to their primitive state. So Frobenius would influence later Yoruba historians such as Saburi Biabaku, which, there's probably some Yorubas who would question that, but we're going to continue. And that's a depiction of Aurora from Ife. So you have in the 1920s in Nubia, George Reisner, considered the father of Nubiology and Egyptology, wrote about Kerma, the first Nubian kingdom, that the social mingling of the 3 races, the Egyptian, the Nubian, and the Negro, resulted in the production of offspring of mixed blood who didn't inherit the mental qualities of the highest race, in this case the Egyptian, and that a proportion of the offspring will perpetuate the qualities of the male parent, and thus the highest race will not necessarily disappear. When he encountered what was unambiguously Nubian material, and we all know Nubian is a misnomer, Nubian or Nahesi just means southerner. When he encountered what was unambiguously Nubian material from the 25th dynasty, he still dismissed it and intentionally misattributed the artifacts and the entire dynasty origin to the light-skinned Libyans, beginning a debate on the origins of the Napadan kingdom, which eventually conquered Egypt, solely based on the premise that the black Nubians couldn't have possibly established the dynasty themselves. Reisner in turn influenced later historians such as Anthony John Arkell's History of the Sudan. Now, I want to put this here because this is a little bit surface level. Just because someone is influenced by the work of another scholar doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with that scholar. And the same could be said for Biabaku and Frobenius. That could be said for Arkell and Reisner. When you do a full literature review, you kind of have to see the components of each scholar that agree and disagree. So it's not enough to say that they influenced. You kind of have to show with respect to what. And he doesn't really do the best job of that here. He kind of leaves the reader up to the conclusion that they were all on the same Hamiticist path and they all agreed with the same elements of each other's theory, which is definitely not true. But we can continue. In the 1900s in southern Africa, at the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, archaeologists Theodore Bent and Richard Hall, who were the pioneers in the studies of Zimbabwe culture, believed that Africans could not have possibly built or even founded the city of Great Zimbabwe. Richard Hall went on to destroy much of surface materials in the ruins, claiming that the materials were recent Bantu corruptions of the original white Semitic builders. Some of what was destroyed, unfortunately, included several constructions, materials, and graves of royals and other notables that contained invaluable artifacts, which later historians were deprived of in reconstructing Zimbabwe's past. In Ethiopia, historian Conti Rossini claimed that the civilized elements of Ethiopia, such as food production and state-born political organization, were introduced by South Arabian groups who colonized the North Horn of African region from the Red Sea. This speculative account of Ethiopian history remained unchallenged well into the 1950s. On the East African coast in the 1920s, the British colonial administrators seeking to suppress Swahili identity and their cultural history concocted the fictional Persian colonial state called the Zinj Empire, centered at the city of Kilwa, which they claimed was in control of the entire coast in the medieval era. These ideas were given academic merit by British historians Reginald Coupland and James Kirkman, who were the first professional modern historians of the Swahili. Now, I think the Swahili have their own historians, in many of their narratives, particularly the Shirazi, about being derived of a so-called Persian or Western Asian descent has been verified by genetic studies to the extent that they are partially descended from them and mostly inter-Africans, speaking of the royals of the Swahili culture. But when it comes to these Europeans may have been some of the first historians of the Swahili and the Swahili culture. So Reginald claimed that the entire coast was ruled by immigrant colonists who engaged in grand slave trading that affected the kingdoms of the interior and relegated the Swahili to slaves or wives of these Arab Persian immigrants. Kirkman claimed that the Swahili ruins belonged not to Africans but Arabs and Persians, with some African blood, claiming that Africans were incapable of such achievements. Similar ideologies were present in the Western Sudan, where light-skinned Berbers were assumed to have introduced state building, metallurgy, and domesticated crops to their dark-skinned southern neighbors, such as the Mandinka. For those who are familiar with just the conversations that we've had with respect to Ouagadougou and Tichit and the Saharan hypothesis that has been conceptualized, by Musa Lam, when you look at the Saharan hypothesis, it basically states that most of these West African states are the descendants of these Saharan populations, many of which were described by Dr. Andrew B. Smith as white. These white so-called Africans descended into West Africa and developed West African civilization. And for those like Patrick J. Munson and Kevin McDonald, who promote, even though they don't have specific, descriptive, explicit archaeological evidence, they promote the development of the Tichit culture, or they promote the development of the Ouagadougou culture to the Tichit culture. During the Terminal Akinjir period, they describe what is found as Berber syncretism, meaning that it was primarily white Berbers who were the intermediaries between Titcha and Ouagadougou. And these North African Berbers would be the ones who sparked the evolution of the Ouagadougou Empire. So even in conventional modern 2024 historiography, Western scholars are still promoting the idea that the Ouagadougou Empire was developed by these Berbers, by these so-called white Africans, these light-skinned Africans. Shout out to the fight doctor in the building. Sounds like the dynastic race theory. It literally is exactly that. Came in on its own. You're going to have to tell me what you mean by that, Nyoka and Dege. And with that, we finna keep on going through this. So, and in the Great Lakes region of Eastern Central Africa, where so-called Hamitic groups claimed to be Tutsi or Hima, are said to have immigrated to invaded, displaced, and conquered autochthonous groups, and supposedly introduced civilization, metallurgy, and statecraft to Negroid groups who apparently had no knowledge of such. These wildly inaccurate theories were given credibility by professional historians, archaeologists, linguists, and anthropologists working in concert with the colonial government to deny and deliberately misattribute African civilizations to white, adjacent, and fictitious Hamitic groups. While critiques of Eurocentrist themes have been offered multiple times, especially by historians and archaeologists of Africa, often taking up much of the introductions to their books, these critiques fall short of identifying the root of the problem with Eurocentrism, which is that the premise of these Semitic theories and diffusionism theories was the underlying prejudice against non-Western people rather than a genuine attempt at scientific inquiry in non-Western history. The debate on who built Great Zimbabwe wasn't premised on a scientific comparison with Middle Eastern cities of its supposed builders, but on a racist conception that the Shona people and other Bantu-speaking groups, so-called Bantu-speaking groups, right, couldn't build such structures. The misattribution of Swahili ruins to Arabs wasn't built on rigorous research between Arab and Swahili construction materials and styles, nor was it based on extensive studies of the Swahili language and its history, but instead on the prejudice thinking that the Swahili couldn't have been the originators of their civilization and couldn't be the builders of the ruins found along the East African coast. The same bad faith is behind the theories of West African metallurgy being introduced from Carthage, claims of African cereals being solely introduced from the Middle East, and African cities existing only as foreign outposts. So now we're going to get to the meat and potatoes, the rise of Afrocentrism. Now, those of y'all who are here y'all know the importance of Afrocentrism. Now, let's just see the way that this author describes Afrocentrism. As these historians dress colonial racist interpretations of African history under the cloak of academic credibility, a counter movement was growing among scholars of African descent in the Americas and the diaspora, one that in many ways mirrored the racist-centered ideologies of colonial scholars, but inversed their hypothetical center of world civilizations from Western civilization to Africa, specifically Egypt, in large part drawn from the writings of 19th century Egyptologists. Now, this sentence right here is bullshit. This is the spot where this article starts to go left field. For one, Africana history, Africana scholarship is not just some inverted version of Western scholarship. It actually has a long tradition, even on the African continent, with scholars like Ibrahim Njoya, right? Ahmed Baba, right? Different scholars, in ancient Kemet, different scholars in the civilizations of West Africa, Timbuktu and Gao, right? These scholars wrote down their history. These scholars had an understanding, a developing and evolved understanding of what reality was in these different fields of knowledge. They were not divorced from their ancestry. Even when you're dealing with some of the scholars of the diaspora, Martin Delaney, Edward Blyden, Alexander Crummell, even Africanus Horton, who was on the continent. These were different Black scholars engaging with each other as the Ma'afa was occurring, as the international enslavement of African people was occurring. So this isn't some disjointed movement, of scholarship from the diaspora and from the African continent specifically to combat, racism, even though that was part of it. But this is a continuous system, Dr. Kwame Nantambu speaks about the origins of Pan-Africanism, and he situates it in, the 31st century, 32nd, 31st century BCE up into the modern time, and he actually puts it up in stages. But the idea that, this is just some reactionary movement to Afrocentrism being a reactionary movement to Eurocentric scholarship, it's just bullshit. It's just completely bullshit. And, he continues, this movement later came to be known as Afrocentrism, the foundations of which were laid in racially segregated US, where history and race were politicized and considered central to people's identity and government policy. So again, the idea that Afrocentrism is Americocentric is false. Afrocentrism is centered in Africa. It's based upon African scholars, and it's not even just the United States. You have the Caribbean, Eric Williams, the great Black Jacobins with Claude McKay. You have Brazil and South America with scholarship going back to the Quilombos, right, with Zumbi and Dandara dos Palmares, right? So again, the Americocentric conception of African-centered analysis is just a problem. It's false. It's BS. So let's continue. While the U.S. produced archaeologists like James Henry Breasted, who studied ancient Egypt and created the Great White Race hypothesis, in which ancient Egyptians were supposedly the origins of the white race, in all civilizations there was also a growing crop of amateur scholars studying ancient Egypt that belonged to fraternal orders in the American white and black middle class. This resulted in the proliferation of Masonic, Theosophical, spiritualist, and esoteric writers in ancient Egypt, which influenced the Black American middle class. The most notable of these lodges was the Prince Hale Grand Lodge in Boston, which had major figures like William Monroe Trotter and Booker T. Washington. Again, this is another problem because it ignores some of the West and Central African societies like the Ekbe, who influenced a lot of these enslaved Africans, in the United States, were from these civilizations, were from the Igbo people, were from the Yoruba people, were from the Bamenda people, the Tikar people. And they had their own indigenous, societies, what you may call deep state societies, lay societies, where they would, associate with one another, engage in certain rituals. They had the ritual of the leopard or Panthera pardis. And a lot of these traditions were incorporated into some of the earliest versions of the Prince Hall Lodge. And Prince Hall was a Pan-Africanist, right? And another thing to note here is that, and he may get onto this further in the article, but the African-American interest in ancient Kimi was about anti-slavery. It was an argument deeply rooted in anti-slavery and rooted in the idea that these civilizations are interconnected from West and Central Africa to the classical civilizations of the Happy River Valley. So if that's the case, there is a complete evolution of African societies that shouldn't be ignored by those who are claiming that Black people are genetically inferior. So that's a point that I think is missed here in this paragraph. So the most influential of Masonic writers to early Afrocentric scholars were the writings of Albert Churchward, an amateur English Egyptologist and adherent of Freemasonry, who claimed the secrets of Freemasonry descended directly, unaltered from ancient Egyptian wisdom and customs. He advanced a very hyper-diffusionist Egyptocentric worldview with Egypt as the origin of all civilization, religion, laws of nature, code of laws, and everything else, claiming that no other nation had improved upon them since. He claimed that the Egyptians sent out colonies all over the world and that all other religions were imitations of Egyptian wisdom, and that the belief systems of the Greeks, Romans, Jews only practiced perversions of ancient Egyptian beliefs. Now, I think there's a little bit of a problem here. Churchward, personally, I would replace Churchward with Grafton Elliott Smith. But also at the same token, I think it's incorrect to castigate Africana scholars for looking towards the work of European scholars, even if the work of European scholars was prominent at their time. Because within any realm of scientific analysis, you want to do a literature review and you want to make sure that you have all aspects of each argument and each perspective available. So I would say that they were correct in viewing these works. And I also would not state that their analysis completely mirrored, the analysis of Albert Churchward. Where this article kind of falls flat is it doesn't really give specific examples of how they were mirroring Churchward's work, putting them side by side. That's what I think would be necessary if you wanted to prove this point. Other than that, it's just a claim with very little support. And he does have references here, but the references, I don't think they're good enough to articulate what he's trying to say within this particular article. So again, despite Churchward's racist beliefs about Africans outside of Egypt, Afrocentrists nevertheless held on to his writings in church for historical sources of pride to counter the Eurocentrist prejudices because Egypt was the only African civilization that Europeans held in high regard. Having adopted Churchward's theories, Afrocentrists then needed only to prove that all ancient Egyptians were racially black. Again, he's seeming like, what this seems like is that he got one of these scholars like Stephen Howe or Clarence Walker. He got their text and he literally imposed it on this article. There's very, very little analysis, like independent analysis, on what Afrocentrists specifically believed, what Churchward's positions specifically are. And he's not even really showing a diversity of Hamiticist thought, because even among those who believed in the white, West Eurasian pastoralist theory, they didn't all agree on every single detail of their ideology. So by not showing specificity and examples, literally it just looks like a copy-paste work. Maybe he rearranged a few things, but generally the thesis of some of the scholars who are against Africana studies, he's basically imposing them, in this article. So among those who adhered to Churchward's hyper-diffusionist theories of ancient Egypt was the writer Molefi Asante. That is insane. That is insane to state that Molefi Asante is a hyper-diffusionist. That is probably the most insane sentence that I've read. Not even the full sentence, right? And Molefi Asante, a Black American who grew up in a segregated Georgia. That's insane. It's insane to say Molefi Asante because he's not giving an accurate evolution of Africana studies. He's not talking about Martin Delany. He didn't mention him once. He didn't mention Alexander Crummell. He didn't mention David Walker. He didn't mention Sterling Stuckey's text. He didn't mention Antenor Furman. He didn't mention Anna Julia Cooper. He didn't mention any of them at all. At all. And to say that Molefi Asante is specifically adhering to Churchward when he's been publishing, textbooks, Africana studies textbooks into the 21st century is insane. This is somebody who's not familiar with Molefi Asante's work. And again, it just looks like he's copying and pasting ideology from these anti-Africana scholars, these white and, these Kunologist scholars who are against Africana studies because they're against Pan-African nationalism. So let me continue. A central theme of Asante's work involved describing the origin of all civilizations to Africa, specifically Egypt. Insane. That's not true. That's definitely not true about Molefi Asante. And that's generally not true about Africana scholars. The argument is not necessarily that pharaonic populations were the instigators of civilizations on the African continent. Generally speaking, the argument is that the prototype for the African type of state, the African mode of production, as described by Cheikh Anta Diop, as described even by Augustine Ho, right? The legendary Cameroonian archaeologist and historian. The argument is that it's a prototype that you could use to understand the evolution of societies on the African continent. Now, in some cases, when you're dealing with the Wangara Inner Empire, right, that we talk about in Galam, Tajara, Zagara, you do have cases where this pharaonic state evolved into different forms. But at the same time, even when pharaonic populations were interacting, intermarrying, intermingling with different populations of the African continent, speaking of the Ouagadougou Empire, speaking of Niani, speaking of Kanem, even those cases, you still have specific local development with respect to the environmental and geopolitical and socio-political elements, factors on the ground within those particular locales. So it's a complete mischaracterization of Asante's perspective. Asante definitely didn't say that, but in generally of Africana studies and Africana scholars, that that the argument is a direct line, right, to classical Africa or ancient Kimi. That's not true. That's not a proper characterization of Africana studies. So he writes that Egypt formed the basis of African cultures and its technologies and philosophies spread to the ancient Greeks and other civilizations. The Europeans then conspired to brainwash Africans of this past knowledge, and that Africans, both home and in the diaspora, should reclaim their glorious past. And I low-key even want to Stephen Howe, again, Stephen Howe is an anti-African. He is an anti-African scholar. He is against Afrocentrism. He is against Pan-African nationalism. So the fact that he's just referencing Stephen Howe willy-nilly without even speaking about the bias of that scholar is just incorrect. It's just wrong. So Asante also cites two older influential Afrocentrist scholars like Chancellor Williams, you can capitalize his name, and Cheikh Anta Diop. I'm going to just scroll back up just to see this 12, who this 12 is. Again, Stephen Howe. So like literally this whole section right here is just a copy paste of Stephen Howe, who is a racist, who is an anti-African, anti-Black scholar. And he's presenting this as an objective analysis of Africana studies. You just copy paste Stephen Howe and you just put it into this article and act like you know something. So again, this last thing, this is wrong. This is the conception of ancient Kimi and Kush is the classical African civilization, the prototype for the type of African development seen across the continent, specifically the African mode of production. The idea that, Nile Valley Basin, the Ethiopian migration model isn't even centered on ancient Kimi. It centers the entire Happy River Basin, the entire Nile Basin, from the Delta to the Great Lakes region. And from that basin is where you get the majority of the languages, cultures, and material cultures and social cultures on the African continent. That's the argument. Again, there are examples that we can attest to both orally, archaeologically, genetically, linguistically, where pharaonic populations definitely spread into the interior of the African continent. And we could express that from a multivariate perspective. But at the same token, they were still influenced by local conditions in the particular locales that they settled in. So it's not a one-to-one, analog in the way that, this author and Stephen Howe was trying to mischaracterize Africana studies. So Diop is credited with the popularization of ancient Egypt, Kimi, as a genuine Black African civilization. And he describes it as a popularization and not a fact. We done had all these scholars, all these white Egyptologists say that, ancient Kemet was a Black civilization. We done proved it ad nauseum that they call themselves Black people. But here we are saying it's a popularization as opposed to an affirmed fact. He claims that the emergence of all civilization and the biological origin of humanity took place in Africa. That's a fact. That's a fact that humans are from Africa. It's not he claims, that's a fact, right? That Egypt was a Black civilization and that ancient Greek and the Europeans took everything of value from the Egyptian culture. I mean, if you go over some of the Greeks themselves, like Thales of Miletus, right? That's what they say themselves about it. Let's look at his reference here. Douglas Northrop. Okay. Diop emphasized that Africans should draw their intellectual, political, and social inspiration from ancient Egypt, just as Europeans did from the Greco-Latin civilization. Again, classical civilization. That African humanity should draw from the pharaonic culture. Ancient Egyptian and Meroitic writing should replace Latin and Greek, and that Egyptian law should replace Roman law. Diop also espoused race realism lies. That's not true. That's and claiming that Africa was culturally distinct from Eurasia. That's not race realism. Saying that there's cultural distinctions between two different populations is not race realism. That's not the definition of race realism. So much of Diop's work overwhelmingly quotes the writings of 19th century historians like Seligman and Frobenius. Again, that's not a problem. Just because you overwhelmingly quote someone, again, from Stephen Howe, biased scholarship from Stephen Howe. So this is like 3 sources from Stephen Howe. He just took Stephen Howe's book and put it in this article. That's literally what he did. This is the 3rd source, right? And again, just because you quote someone, that's called a literature review. Just because you quote someone doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with all of their talking points. And he doesn't even cite examples. He just copy paste Stephen Howe and just run with it. That's it. So a few Afrocentrists covered regions outside of Egypt. One region of much attention was Mesoamerica, and the supposed pre-Columbian landings of Africans in America based on a selective list of alleged similarities between Mesoamerican and Egyptian cosmologies, architecture, and the Native Americans' artistic sculptural self-depictions. From the Mayan pyramids to the presence of dark-skinned Native American groups to the Olmec heads' peculiar phenotypes, which Europeans had in their arbitrary constructions of race reserved for Black Africans, and some of the scholars who spoke about the Olmecs Africoid phenotype were actually indigenous Mesoamericans and Mexicans. So it wasn't all just Europeans. But a few books have been published by Afrocentrists like Ivan van Sertima and Barry Fell, both of whom derived most of their theories from the writings of Leo Wayner's attempt at documenting Africans in pre-Columbian America. Again, a fourth source that I've seen by Stephen Howe, and these are the sources that I checked, right? So again, like, and I see Jehudi Ma'at in the comments. That's not, I mean, please don't bastardize the argument. Black as in skin color, some of the populations were black. But when we use the idiomatic expression of black, it's coming from our cosmogony and it's coming from our cosmology. If you were to look up at the sky, you would see blackness in the space of the sky. Also, at the same token, outside of the electromagnetic spectrum of visible light, what we have is black, and that's the majority of the universe, composed of something called dark matter and dark energy. So the understanding of black in ancient African writing is according to our divinity, our cosmogony, our theological perspective. It's not limited to a skin description, but it's more of a holistic representation of the meaning of black. So again, even going down that road, that's a bastardization of the ideology. That's a bastardization of the point. So, and again, they describe themselves as black, the people in ancient Kemet, and when we say black pride, when we say black is beautiful, when we say black power, we're using the same idiomatic expression that Paleo-Africans used that can be documented in classical Africa in ancient Kemi and Kush. So they called themselves black the way we call ourselves black today as a form of empowerment. And that has been proved ad nauseum. A general critique of Afrocentrism is offered by Stephen Howe. No, he's not genuine, he's biased. Who observed that Afrocentrism is premised on three fallacies: unanimism, belief that Africa was culturally homogenous. No one ever stated that. No one ever stated that. The cultural unity of Black Africa is not uniformity. Absolutely not. It's not uniformity. So that's a lie by Stephen Howe. Diffusionism, the belief that human phenomena have one common origin, lies. Africana scholars never promoted that, ever. Never, ever promoted that. That comes from a monocausal archaeological inference from cultural historical archaeology, which is completely separate from the multivariate forms of archaeology developed within the Africana tradition. So no, that's 0 for 2. And then primordialism, that present customs and identities are derived from an ancient past and unbroken continuity. False. That's also, he's 0 for 3. And this is a Stephen Howe reference. He's 0 for 3. Unanimism, false. Diffusionism, false. Primordialism, false. Africana scholars promote, the evolution of the material cultures, the evolution of the philosophical system, the evolution of the logic system, the evolution of the languages. This is false. This is 100% false. And again, Stephen Howe is a biased Eurocentric scholar, a biased white scholar who is against Pan-Africanism, against African nationalism. So again, this is BS. So perhaps the most potent critique of Afrocentrism comes from the African historian and archaeologist Augustine Hole. Newsflash: Augustine Hole is an African-centered scholar. Augustine Hole was one of the official presenters at the Diop conference. Augustine Hole used L3F3 mtDNA haplography to discuss the Happy River Valley origins of Chadic populations in the Lake Chad Basin in confirmation with the Ethiopian migration model. So he behaved as if nothing new had occurred in African archaeology, right? And again, this is a specific critique with respect to Diop's analysis of the origin of the Serer people of Senegambia, right? Now, recent scholarship by students of the Ethiopian school, like Diallo, Dr. Diallo at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, have confirmed this, migration model with respect to the Serer. And then you also have other scholars like Dr. Toyin Falola, who have spoken about the fact that many of the elements of the Serer divination system and theological system originated in the Happy River Valley, the Happy River Basin. So the up-to-date scholarship has actually affirmed what Diop was speaking about, in contradistinction to this critique, this specific critique. And again, this author doesn't give the context of this quote. A lot of the enemies of Africana studies, they use this quote to try to pit Augustine Hull with they try to pit Augustine Hull against Cheikh Anta Diop, but they don't put it in context, because if you put it in context, it would expose that this is a lie. So Augustine Hull today, legendary Cameroonian archaeologist and historian, has a lot of respect for Cheikh Anta Diop, even though they may not agree on all of the principles. He was a speaker at the Diop conference. So like, to act as if he was just some enemy who hated Diop is a lie. He actually has a lot of love and respect for him. And it's racist scholars and chronologists who try to use this one quote to pit the two scholars against each other. So it says this was indeed valid critique, because when Diop first published Nation Nègre et Culture in 1954, the overtly racist interpretation of African history was mainstream, as I have outlined. But Diop continued his theories as late as 1974 in The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. Again, he's acting as if, Diag wasn't involved with Diop. Theophile Obenga didn't have any disagreements or arguments with Cheikh Anta Diop. He's acting as if in that 20-year span, he completely, like, nothing changed. Like, he wasn't trying to set up, or he didn't set up a radiometric laboratory for radiometric dating in Senegal. He wasn't laying the foundations of the Musée de Civilisation Nègre, right, in Senegal. Like, they're acting as if he was doing nothing. He's acting as if he was doing nothing in that 20-year period. So, it's just insane at this point. This is going left field, super left field. And again, what is this from? How? Every source is from How. What is this? Seriously, what is this? This is biased. This article is biased. This one scholar who is against Africana studies, every single source that you use is from this scholar. Every single one. This is not right. This is not how you do scholarship. This is just no. This is no. So the African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, which is it combats, unilineal evolution, the cultural evolutionist. It actually combats them. That's why it's civilization or barbarism, because they try to put a unilineal evolution of the majority of the cultures on the African continent, place Africans at the bottom and Europeans at the top. So he was literally combating social classical evolution of Darwin, this 19th century archaeologist who applied Darwinism to material cultures and created unilineal evolution. That's what this book was the African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality was combating. It was combating those perspectives that were still coming into fruition of scholarship at that time in Charles Murray's bell curve and other scholarship of the like, right? In that same period, in those same generations. So in most of these racist themes had been replaced by more professional and more academic interpretation of African history. From How? Between Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism, the rise of moderate scholarship. So contemporaneous with the rise of Afrocentrism was a shift to a moderate reading of African history between the 60s and 80s, which coincided with the independence wave of Africa and the civil rights movements in the US that witnessed the rejection of overtly racist Eurocentric themes of African history. This is a copy and paste because you don't have examples here. So whenever he makes a claim without any examples, you know that he copied and pasted from another scholar. While the overtly racial elements of Eurocentric theories were being abandoned in the formative years of the post-colonial academic historiography of Africa, which began in the 50s and 60s, the diffusionist and Hamitic models continued to influence early historians, especially when it came to African metallurgy, complex state formation, and growth, plant and animal domestication, the rise and fall of states, writing, adoption, use, and the innovations of new technologies, etc. Again, he doesn't list any examples for any of these cases. African metallurgy with Hamadi Bakoum, who is a Ethiopian scholar, student of Cheikh Anta Diop, and then Dem, another student, Dr. Dem, Haj Dem, another student of Cheikh Anta Diop, who have connected the metallurgical cultures of ancient Kimi to Inner Africa, saying that they came from the same root, which they theorized was somewhere around Niger and the Lake Chad Basin with the Egazarian tradition. So again, with metallurgy, and with iron technology, I'm a structural engineer, so I deal with this type of stuff. He's wrong on that case. And then again, the idea that Diop, and I have to scroll back up, Diop in the Cairo Symposium in 1974 opposed Hamiticism when he said that Hamito-Semitic or Afro-Asiatic doesn't exist because that so-called language philo is based upon aerial diffusion between African languages and so-called Semitic. He opposes Hamiticism. Diop's scholarship is against Hamiticism, 100% against Hamiticism. So to try to put Hamiticism as an analog to Diop's scholarship is completely crap. That's wrong. It's crazy. It's insane to do that. And I'm going to take a real quick a water before we continue. Yeah, the whole science field, it's a joke. I mean, this technically is an independent. This technically is an independent article, but there's a lot of BS in it. And one of my members wanted me to review it, so I am reviewing it. So again, Cairo Symposium of 74. Diop opposed Hamiticism. You can't put him next to it when he literally said the Hamito-Semites don't exist. The Hamite people don't exist. So how could he be a Hamiticist when he said that the Hamites don't exist? I mean, it's like there's no way that you could pin that on him. But we will continue. So this moderate model of diffusionist and Hamitic theories without racial elements can be observed in the theories of various historians like John Fay's work on ancient Ghana and West African empires, in which he overstated the Berber influence on its rise, wealth, and fall, which is still contemporaneous. Like if you look at Patrick Munson and Kevin MacDonald from Cambridge, modern scholars, they still emphasize the Berber syncretism in the terminal Akinjir period of Tichet, as well as the Berber influence in the development of the interlinking, the intermediary point between Tichet and Ouagadougou. They say that the Berbers were the immediate predecessors. These scholars, even Christopher Wise, made that claim that John Henry Clark opposed, right? When he said that the Galoma people defined by the Soninke were Masi from the Volta River Valley and not Mandinka per se. So again, and where is this from? Robin Law. I mean, Robin Law is not as bad as Stephen Howe. Some of his stuff is okay. Some of his stuff is something that we could consider. But even in Robin Law's analysis, right, West Africans didn't whole cloth adopt Hamiticism. They actually made their own brand of study based upon not European influence, but based upon them trying to articulate the history of their own people. So the analysis of so-called Hamiticism within West African historiography is actually from a more independent branch, as opposed to something that was imposed upon them. And even Zatranuk, a scholar like Zatranuk opposed Afigbo who is a famous Igbo scholar, when he said that Hamiticism was not imposed by West Africans from outside Eurasians. These things that some may classify as analogous to Hamiticism were independently developed. So again, Lafranco Ricci's work on the formation of early Ethiopian states, where he exaggerated the Sabian influence in pre-Askimite era of northern Africa. James Kirkman, who misinterpreted Swahili oral history and origin myth as factual events. And again, the Omani and Pashtun, even origin of the Shirazi people that are described in their oral narratives are factual, and they have actually been confirmed recently by genetic studies. So then you have Neville Chaddock on the Swahili coast, who saw the Swahili as an African civilization with heavy Arabic and Persian influences. These influences were mainly the Shirazi royals, and it's not a myth. Shirazi royals who married into these families. They married into the families of these traders from Central Asia and West Eurasia. In Nubia was William Y. Adams, who characterized the Nubian 25th dynasty as a classic example of a former barbarian people turning the tables on their oppressors, and many other historians focus on West Africa and Southern Africa. So the relative influences of Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism on Africans in the study of African history. In terms of review, citations, and circulation of their publications, Afrocentric scholars are dwarfed by the Eurocentric and moderate peers. And again, this moderate thing, like he's positioning moderates as if they're more accurate, which he's not even showing. Like, he doesn't show enough specific examples and evidence to discern who's right and who's wrong. It's more of an ideological thing, and because a lot of it is a copy paste from Stephen Howe, it's even difficult to navigate what is what within this article. To me, this article is very poorly written. Overall, it is one of the worst articles that I have seen about Africana studies. Pretty much everything about Africana studies and its characterization is inaccurate, is wrong, and it's really easy to disprove. But we're gonna continue. And shout out to Eshu Ogun, Abibi Fahoje. Shout out to all the fam in the building. Happy Juneteenth to y'all. In contrast, Eurocentrism wasn't and isn't just a minor perversion of an otherwise unbiased inquiry in the field of African historiography. It's the very foundation of the field. And when you say African historiography, if you're speaking about Western historiography of Africa, Western Africanism, yes. If you're speaking about African-centered scholarship, no, that's crap. And its adherents were the pioneers of African history and the self-appointed founders of their respected fields. Eurocentric theories from the core of the way African history is discussed, and it's Eurocentric scholars that set the themes and topics of African history from the fundamental determining if Ethiopian and Nubian historiography should be categorized as Middle Eastern to the trivial, the tour guidebooks and museum guidebooks of African ruins, relics that were written during the colonial era and are used despite containing discredited theories on African history. Worse was still Eurocentrism effects on the social institutions and psyche of African groups. History is political and always been politicized, whether as a source of cultural pride or as a way of othering groups of people to legitimize authority or justify atrocities. For example, in Rwanda, the Tutsi and Hutu were until colonization, a simple caste system in a complex relationship between the elites of several kingdoms vis-a-vis their subjects. This caste system was far from unique to Rwanda, but was present in much of the eastern half of Central Africa, example in the kingdoms of Nkore in Uganda, and Karagwe, and various groups in Eastern Congo. Not accurate. That's not. I don't see this as accurate because I don't think any African mode of production society was just a simple caste system. But we can continue. I don't want to harp on that point. During the pre-colonial period, some of these kingdoms were ruled by Tutsi elites and others by Hutu elites, but this relationship was greatly transformed by colonial authorities into a racial designation by promoting and enforcing the Hamitic race myth, stating that a Tutsi was a European under black skin. Okay. Forcefully annexing independent Hutu-led kingdoms under the largely Tutsi-led Yinginya kingdom, segregating schools by educating sons of Tutsi chiefs and leaders and feeding them on a steady diet of their supposed racial superiority over the Hutu, appointing them in colonial administration, and physically creating their racial category by measuring the length of noses, the shape of skulls with calipers, separating relatives and siblings using arbitrary phenotypical differences, and issuing race cards to maintain the segregation. Now, this is kind of interesting narrative, but he's using an example of othering, so let's continue. This process fueled animosity between these two groups, sparking a mass series of murders. And from 59 to later, where 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutus were killed in less than 3 months in one of the world's worst genocides, based solely on the Hamitic theory, as best demonstrated in the dumping of bodies in the Kagera River that ultimately pours its waters into the Nile, which the Inter-Hamwe extremists claimed was the fastest way to send Hamites, meaning Tutsis, back to their homeland in Ethiopia and Egypt. I think you need to add the European and French imperialism to this. Even though Hamiticism was an influence, I think you need to add that to this. And again, just because you're claiming that they did something because of a particular historiographical theory doesn't make it false. You actually have to show that it's false. So I could do something bad with, like, let's say that the sky is blue and I go commit a mass murder, or I go commit sexual assault. Just because I did that doesn't mean that the sky isn't blue. It means that I did it for a bad reason. So just because, Tutsis were, massacred because of certain Hamiticist views doesn't make those views false. You actually have to show that they're false, right? So the effects of this war spilled into the DRC, which sparked the First and Second Congo War, one that involved over 7 African countries, claimed over 5 million lives, in the most disastrous war since World War II, and retarded the growth of the country for close to a decade. The above example is just one of many conflicts created by the deliberate politicization of Eurocentrism in Africa, not including justifying the brutal apartheid system of white minority rule in South Africa, based on the myth of empty land, right? Which is something that's true, legitimizing the plunder and colonization of Zimbabwe and the later establishment of the segregated state of Rhodesia on false claims of a lost white builders of a great Zimbabwe, and the effects both still plague Southern Africa today. So the case for decolonization of African history, again, this is probably the only thing that we agree with, but how is where we disagree with, because there were so many false claims made in this article. Shout out to Zoo in the chat, Magi stand up. Eurocentrism continues to plague mainstream discourses of African history, at times drowning African historians in vapid meta-commentary of discrediting the racist misconceptions of African history that they don't find the time to engage in the more rigorous work needed to highlight African history itself. The later will require them to unearth new African archaeological discoveries, translate and interpret old African documents, carefully examine the themes of African art, architectural styles, and social dynamics. As Toni Morrison stated, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says that you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. Decolonization requires nothing less than recentering African history with the African societies that made it, instead of bringing up African history only as meta and analytical critiques of Eurocentrism. The latter at times counterintuitively legitimizes Eurocentrism as a valid history theory of the African past. Again, this is what Africana scholars have been doing, but, to categorize them as primordialism, diffusionism, or unanimism is completely inaccurate. Rather than dredging up art in response to Eurocentrists who claimed it didn't exist, the task for African historians is to dredge up African art to better understand the society that made it, rather than digging up African kingdoms to idealize them so as to ridicule the cartoonish racist theories of Eurocentrism that deny their existence. African kingdoms should be studied as a way of correcting colonial and post-colonial institutional deficiencies, instead of treating African achievements as trophies in the mundane tug-of-war against dismissive Eurocentric ideologues. African accomplishments should be seen as the stepping stone which African societies use to chart a clearer path for their progress by taking lessons from the past. History is best useful when it helps those engaging it to grasp the present. Fortunately, many African historians are aware of the need to decolonize African history, and some have taken up on this task more assertively than others, even without having to mention explicitly that they are ridding the field of Eurocentrism. Most notably in the study of Swahili history, where historians such as John Sutton write that the ruins of Kiowa, Songo, Manara, and elsewhere on the coast and islands of Tanzania and Kenya are therefore relics of early Swahili settlements, not those of foreign immigrants or invaders, Arab, Shirazi, or whatever, as is commonly averred. Most people in Tanzania define themselves as Shirazi, so I don't know what he's doing there by putting Shirazi in there. Although the mosques and tombs are by definition Islamic, they are not simple transplants from Arabian or the Persian Gulf. Their architectural style is one which developed locally, being distinctive in both its form and its coral masonry techniques on the Swahili coast. Yeah, I could agree with that. I could agree that the Swahili archaeology is more so connected to Paleo-African traditions, as opposed to being a transplant. So other attempts at decolonizing history can also be seen in the study of West African history, where historians such as Augustine Hull and Roderick McIntosh have reoriented the origin and growth of classic West African empires through their discovery of Titchett's Neolithic primacy on West African domestication. state building and architecture, and the unearthing of the city of Geno, which radically altered the understanding of the pre-Islamic trade and urbanism in West Africa. I'm laughing because, there's no, according to Augustine Hole, there's about a 600 to 800 year gap between the terminal Ticha period in Ghana, or the Ouagadougou Empire, right? So he cautions against, forcefully associating them without evidence, which there isn't to this date. And again, conventional scholars connect those two civilizations with Berbers, like Kevin McDonald, as we discussed earlier. And again, you talk about the Swahili coast, and he doesn't even mention one of the top Swahili archaeologists, Felix Chami, who is also a student of the Diopian School of African-Centered Scholarship. So interesting how you just completely leave that out. And that's what happens when you're focusing on narrative and you just copy and paste, arguments from anti-Black, Eurocentric scholars, as you claim to be against Eurocentrism, but you're pushing Stephen Howe, who is obviously racist and obviously anti-Black, right? So another region that's seen significant effort in decolonization is in the study of Zimbabwe cultural sites, where archaeologists like Shadrick Chirukuri and Thomas Huffman have shifted the interpretations of the hundreds of Zimbabwe ruins away from the mythical foreign builders to instead investigate their rightful origins among Shona groups. Unfortunately, these attempts at decolonizing African history remain largely overshadowed by their predecessors, Eurocentrism, which still requires a concerted effort of decolonization from both the historians themselves and school systems in Africa outside the continent. These educational systems perpetuated outdated product of Eurocentric thought into tour guide books and museums and modern journalism and political thought, all of whose perspectives on African history remain stuck in colonial thinking and requires a complete overhaul in their approach to understanding the rich history of the continent. So again, that's it for this. And we can go on to their sources. Robin Law's okay. David O'Connor. That's a source that is bad to use without context. And we could even scroll up to see where he referenced for David O'Connor, because a lot of people mess up that text without the proper context. Okay, so Biabaku, that might have been Caleb Fuller Runzo's article. Okay, which is okay with that. Double checking the sources. Stefan Weinig, who actually spoke about how the Meroitic Empire extended into Central and Southern Africa, which actually opposes his argument. I'm familiar with this German scholar, Stefan Weinig. So where did he use Stefan Weinig? We're just double checking the sources right now. Okay. When he encountered, okay, so maybe he was saying that it was a better interpretation. All right, so he actually did okay with that one. But again, Stefan Weinig actually opposes his theory that there were no interactions between, ancient Kimi and Inner Africa. And then you have Stephen Howe. How many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is that right? He used Stephen Howe. No, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 times he used Stephen Howe, which is insane. And then a Connor again here. All right, so that's it. This poorly written article is by Isaac Samuel of African History Extra. So I personally would give this article like a 2 out of 10, for its accuracy and for its in-depthness in terms of literature review. And when you're doing articles like this, it's better to give examples rather than imposing the narrative of another scholar onto your paper, because somebody like myself who's familiar with the material can very easily dissect it, as I've done today. So what we will do is I'm going to share the link, and then maybe I could go through some of my sources. We've been here for an hour 30. We could chop it up. I don't plan to be here for too long, but I just want to go over I just wanted to go over this article and just show why it's flawed, really. I just wanted to show why it's flawed. So that link should be pinned to the top. And for those of y'all who want to come in and chop it up, feel free. Again, I won't be here for too long. Maybe an hour more max. I just wanted to get this quick live in because this has been something I've been wanting to do since I read this, poorly written article 3 years ago. And if nobody comes up, I may just go over, another presentation that I have, of Diopian historiography, and basically defending Diopian historiography from false claims made against him. So yeah, feel free. Any of the archers, if you want to come in and chop it up, feel free. A shout out to Shu Ogun and Zoo and More One and everybody in the chat. We've just been chopping it up. And, this is something that we have to continuously do in terms of defending our Africana scholars, because it's important that we get the right content now. Shout out to No BS. I'm gonna just chill right now, and I'll give y'all a few minutes, just to chop it up. And if nobody comes on, I may just review that presentation that I just mentioned, and then we could just ride out. Got 31 people in the building. Shout out to y'all for showing up. I really appreciate it. You got no takers so far. I'll give y'all. I would take off soon though. Family life. I got some responsibilities to handle. I feel it. So yeah. So what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna just go briefly through this presentation and just go through some of the facts that I have surrounding Cheikh Anta Diop. The link is pinned to the top if any of you change your mind. But I'm gonna present this real quick. Wait, why is it not allowing me to share? It's not giving me the option. Bear with me briefly as I figure this out. I have this, but it doesn't give me the option. Oh, there it is. Okay, so y'all can see this. I think y'all can see this. No, I don't want this. I want it to be. Okay, y'all see this. We'll screen it. Yeah, I want to make sure this is want to make sure it's alone. The show. So let's just get into this. This is an examination of Ethiopian historiography, assessing the contemporary validity of Africological studies. Presentation that I did in the past. So it just gets into the basics of Diop. He's a member of the Marid Brotherhood, educated in Africo-political historical dynamics at a young age. He organized the first Paris Pan-African Congress in 1951. From 1950 to 1953, he was the Secretary General of the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain. And in 1956, he participated in the First World Congress of Black Artists and Writers. His PhD dissertation on the African influences of European culture and civilizations was accepted in 1960 after being rejected in 1951. This came from the pressure after it was published as Nation Nègre et Culture in 1955. In 1960, Senegal Diop was appointed as a research fellow at the Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire, IFAN, at Dakar University, where he set up a radiocarbon dating laboratory. And in 1961 and 1963, he created the Pan-Africanist political party Bloc des Masses Sénégalaises et Front National du Sénégal, designed to fight European imperialism on the continent. 1966, the first Black World Festival of Arts and Culture held in Dakar, Senegal, honored Dr. Diop and W.B. Du Bois as the scholars who exerted the greatest influence on African thought in the 20th century. In 1971, he was elected vice president of UNESCO Scientific Committee for writing the writing of a history of Africa. In 1974, a milestone occurred in the English-speaking world when the African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality was published. And it was also in 1974 that Obenga and Diop collectively and soundly reaffirmed the African origin of Pharaonic Egyptian civilization at a UNESCO-sponsored symposium in Cairo. In 1981, Diop's last major work, translated in English, Civilization or Barbarism, Civilisation ou Barbarie, an authentic anthropology, was published. And then Diop was the director of the Radiocarbon Laboratory at the Fundamental Institute of Black Africa at the University of Dakar. So we get into the elements of his Diopian historiography. You have oral typology, diachronic linguistics, and onomastics, like the naming conventions such as black, ethnonymy and toponymy, typological, phonological, and morphological correspondences. In the cultural anthropology, it's a method based upon multilineal, socio-political, cultural, environmental evolution of society, and it establishes correlations between internal and external events. Then you have archaeometrics. It introduces brutal certainty, where the only doubt, skepticism, or speculate, where it introduces brutal certainty where there was only doubt, skepticism, or speculations. It results ruin everyday dogmas based upon unscientific notions of historical plausibility. You have dating techniques, chemical analysis, and aerial photography. And actually, before I go on, we just check to make sure. Are we good? We straight? We good? It's popping. So then these are some of the archaeometric methods. You have dendrochronology, the racemization of amino acids, dehydration of obsidian, archaeomagnetism, thermoluminescence, carbon-14, uranium, thorium dating, electron spin resonance, and potassium argon dating. These are some of the datings, the archaeometrics specifically promoted within the Diopian school of historiography, which is what the previous author poorly did not represent. So these are just some of the critiques of Diop, and I kind of cite some of the examples of the people against him, which I don't want to get too much into that. We could do that on a later date. Now we get into historical linguistics, diachronic linguistics, and then we don't even have to get deep into that. I really wanted to get into some of the archaeological theories. And by the way, diffusionism being bad. Some of the main scholars, the respected scholars that maybe the previous author Isaac Samuel would call moderates, they promote diffusion. Chris Ehret promotes diffusion. You can see all of the examples here: raffia cloth, Sudanic agriculture, pastoralism, pottery. They're all throughout Ehret's work. He uses the cultural historical method of archaeology in promotion of diffusionism, right? Neck rest, Middle Nile Basin, neck rest, wheat and barley, right? Iron technology, right? So come on. he literally promotes it throughout his work. Which, there's nothing wrong. It could be false, but at the same token, like when you're trying to criticize Diop for being out of date, as they try to weaponize that Augustine Hole quote, these scholars are still using it. And even Felix Chami has even stated that in certain instances, the history of a population has been deleted or removed, historical culture or culture historical evolution could be useful, or culture historical archaeology specifically, not evolution, or culture historical archaeology could be useful in terms of the reconstruction process. So again, zither instruments, so like concentrated growth on farming lands. Roger Blench promotes diffusion all throughout his scholarship. But it's important to understand, like, to situate Africana archaeology, within with respect to Western archaeology. You have monocausal archaeology. This is one cause origin of a state level society, either from migration or diffusion, right? You have processual archaeology, and this is new archaeology founded in logical positivism. This is more so in reaction to the cultural history archaeological school. Then you have post-processual archaeology, centered in interpretive and structural archaeology. This is just kind of a brief overview of the different instances. Monocausal archaeology would be cultural history archaeology, and that came in response to the unilineal evolutionary theories, or the social classical evolution of Darwinism. These are archaeologists who applied Darwinism to archaeology. So, like, archaeological theory is rooted in cultural anthropological inferences. So you have antiquarianism, centered in the collection of artifacts by stage from the classical to the medieval period, super Eurocentrist, super colonial, right? And then you have, again, as we were discussing before, culture evolution, first unilinear evolution of societies from savage to barbaric to civilization. And this is kind of the origin of Diop's title, Civilization or Barbarism, to counteract these racist theories. So social classical evolution was championed by Johann Bachelfen, Sir James Fraser, Sir John Lubbock, Sir James Summer Maine, John McClellan, Lewis Henry Morgan, and Edward Tyler. And again, these are archaeologists who applied Darwinism to archaeology and the understanding of the evolution of societies. So modern sociocultural evolution rejects most of social classical evolution due to the fact that it was ethnocentric, and it was very Western-centered. Assuming all cultures follow the same path, equated civilization with material cultures, which is not necessarily the case, and is contradicted by evidence, right? Some, not all, supposedly primitive societies are arguably more peaceful and equitably and democratic than many modern societies. So then, social classical evolution was replaced with culture history, right? And this is where you get the so-called diffusionism, migrationism theories. They're based upon a typological method, or an abstraction imposed on the material record by an archaeologist. You're dealing with morphological types, temporal types, functional types. You have a normative view of culture. Culture is a collection of norms that can be seen through the materials. And the criticism is that it's too descriptive and it does not explain why certain norms exist. So it was a general rejection of social classical evolution by cultural historical archaeologists of the early 20th century. And they formulated a concept called Kulturkreis, which in German means cultural area. It views societies as resistant to change. It uses inductive reasoning, and then change comes externally by the way of diffusion, the transfer of ideas, and/or migrationism, the transfer of people. And this is a depiction of that here on the right. So then this was replaced by processual archaeology. So you have Auguste Comte created the notion of positivism and is considered the first modern philosopher of science. It utilizes a method called hypothetico-deductive inferences of observation and hypothesis testing. So that's the logic that underlines processual archaeology. It has multilineal cultural evolution as opposed to the unilineal evolution of the social classical period. And it studies adaptive processes in material cultures driven by the environment. This is championed by Binford, famous archaeologist. He utilizes system theory to describe how elements of a culture interact. And this is championed by Kent Flannery. Then you have analytical archaeology, which is a development of that tradition written by David Clark. And it defines invention, internal development, and external transmission as drivers of cultural change. So you have primary and secondary diffusion, or cultural elements spread between the limits and beyond the limits of a cultural area, respectively. And it defines migration as relocation diffusion, and uses 1 kilometer per year to describe the expansion of agriculture from the Near East to Europe. Then Collette in 1987 links history and process in cities that aspects of material cultures reflect migration. So processual archaeologists interpret specific aspects of cultural change to be the result of outside impact, typically environmentally. So then you have different examples with leaky, and then the rapid transmission of traits. So processual archaeologists also promote mobility, right? So mobility is an important aspect. There's not the Garden of Eden principle. Different populations will always move with respect to structural changes in the environment. So, and then logistically, mobility is a collective strategy used to resource incongruities in the natural environment. So when you have like incongruities or, a unequal distribution of resources, mobility is a solution for that as a foraging strategy. We can continue to go on. This gets a little bit deeper. Later on, we can have a further, in-depth look at just some of these archaeological theories. You have Africological archaeology has its own independent development from Narmer and Kamwaset in the classical Happy River Valley to the pharma system of the medieval West African period to Antonio Furman, Delaney, John Wesley Gilbert, and William Leo Hansberry, who has the largest modern school of African archaeologists. You have Cheikh Anta Diop, who built upon this Africological tradition using a diachronic approach that combines absolute dating with the establishment of historical sequences with respect to a multilineal social, cultural, and political framework. Then you have Obenga's pharaonic anthropology that we use to impose upon, that we use as inferences for our archaeological methodology. You have Dika Akwa, another Ethiopian scholar, who developed Malongi as a historical spatio-temporal model of analysis with an axis of space, time, history, and then a subsumption principle as the intersection of those different axes. Hamadi Bakum's work, Abubakari Musa Lam with his comparative archaeology work. So as you can see, you have differences with respect to the archaeological traditions developed on the African continent and, with respect to the West. And I just wanted to show that to just disprove the notion that Diop was just mirroring the archaeological traditions of the African continent. I just wanted to show that. And, with respect to that, that's all I have today. Again, Diop was not a Hamiticist. Africana scholarship is not Hamiticist. Molefi Asante did not just whole cloth borrow Albert Churchward. That article that we read previously was terrible. It was trash. Stephen Howe, Clarence Walker, all these people are propagandists. And, come to this page, come to these sources of information. Go into Magi Archers if you want an accurate representation of African thought. And with respect to that, shout out to everybody for coming in. You get my Cash App, Cash App Comgyverse, $Comgyverse. If you like this presentation, I'm gonna put that up there right there. If you like the presentation, so with respect to that, I will say we are out of here.
Louisa.